Intimate Rights Group. My name is Chelsea Horn.
I'm Adrian Martinez.
And I'm Deontay Fox.
And today we will be discussing the negative effects of disenfranchisement of formerly incarcerated individuals.
So for our final project, we decided to do a policy paper where we suggest tangible goals of reform, ways we can alleviate the negative effects of disenfranchisement for ex-offenders. And we did this little podcast as a little introduction into our policy paper to give you more background on the issues at hand. Yeah, we hope
we
you like
originally wanted to do a documentary, but we had a very hard time of finding people to help us. We emailed a lot of people, we called people, but they never answered or picked back. So we decided to do this podcast
and this
instead.
Policy paper. Also, writing a policy paper was pretty difficult too. Just trying to find those tangible goals that aren't just like broad, but it was a lot of fun in making the policy paper and in making this podcast. So we hope you enjoy it. So to give some background, all of us watched the documentary 13th, which talks about the 13th Amendment, abolishing the institution of slavery. And in this documentary, it talks about the era of mass incarceration and that there's an exception to that 13th Amendment where everyone is free with the exception of those that needed to be punished as criminals.
Yeah, and I think that's very important to note because after slavery, the Jim Crow era was a period of time where Black people were criminalized for doing very menial things that weren't crimes. There were vagrancy laws, there were laws for just for loitering, basically just laws for living. And I think this kept Black people in a sort of second-class status. And now we have the mass incarceration era where mainly African-American males are being targeted in the prison system. And it's almost like a rebirth of the Jim Crow era. So it's been being referred to as the new Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander in her book. And I think that's very important to note.
Yeah. So basically, like, to give a bigger picture, the United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. It only constitutes 5% of the population, but it makes up 25% of the world's prison population, which is very surprising.
Black people constitute 1 in 3, well, African-American males have a 1 in 3 chance of going to prison, whereas white males have a 1 in 17 chance. And also, Black men only make up about 6% of the U.S. population, but make up 40% of the prison population. So obviously there's a really, really huge disparity between people of different races being in prison, and there's several reasons as to why this happens.
We also see that since this mass incarceration, there's federal disenfranchisement in the United States equals 6.1 million Americans that cannot vote because of felon conviction, and 1 in every 13 are African American.
Yeah. So the issue of mass incarceration relates to the Black Lives Matter movement because, as Chelsea said before, Blacks are disproportionately targeted and they're incarcerated. So one of the platforms of the Black Lives Matter movement is to end mass incarceration and push for that reform needed to stop that.
So the era of mass incarceration means that there are a lot more people dealing with the difficulties of post-prison life, such as not being able to get public assistance, not being able to apply for public housing.
Not being able to get a job.
Right. Also not being able to use student loans, federal student loans, or there are just basically a lot of things that everyone considers to be like a normal civic right that ex-offenders do not have. There are supposedly 40,000 collateral consequences to being in prison. Even after you get out of prison, there's political, social, and economic difficulties. Some of the economic difficulties could be, as Adrian said, not getting a job. Also, this keeps ex-prisoners in a second-class status. And we also choose not to use the terms ex-felon or ex-convict because it can be very demeaning and it adds to the already social stigma that ex-offenders have. So we try to refrain from using that in our policy paper.
So while there are many negative effects, like political, social, economic traps that keeps these ex-offenders in their place as second-class citizens, for the purpose of this policy paper, we're going to focus on the negative effects of disenfranchisement of these formerly incarcerated individuals. Now, disenfranchisement, most people think that just means you can't vote. And while that's true, there's so much more that comes with that. Because you can't vote, you can't own a gun, you can't leave the country, you can't get public assistance, you can't do a lot of things. And those are just some of the consequences that come with being disenfranchised in your post-prison life. So a couple weeks ago, I was able to talk to someone who knew more about this. I ran into a guy named Tony outside of the rights, and he was trying to get people to sign a petition for voter rights restoration. And he was basically yelling and saying, excuse me, don't you think these people deserve a second chance? This, just your signature, it doesn't do anything, it just gets them on the ballot. And I was just very interested in it. I was able to talk to him about it for at least like 10, 15 minutes. And he was just telling me about all these things that formerly incarcerated individuals can't do because of this disenfranchisement that they have. They can't get federal jobs, they can't get jobs, it's difficult for them to be admitted to schools, and they're left with this social stigma and society tends to look down on them because of it. So we're hoping that through this policy paper, more people will be interested in signing these petitions and helping get ex-offenders' rights restored back to them. So moving on and narrowing our scope, we're going to talk about Florida's current status when it comes to post-prison life.
So ex-offenders have to wait 5 years after prison, parole, or probation until they can apply for restoration of their voting rights, and it could be another possible 7 to 9 years until their appeals are actually approved. And this process, we feel, is very lengthy, and also it can be very daunting and discouraging.
So it's like not worth it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Especially because we see that it's 8% approval rate, while in Iowa and Kentucky it's over 80% approval rates for people that are applying. They usually just have to write a letter with a recommendation. Well, Florida, you have to go to like a 3-person panel, and they determine if you're eligible.
And even with that, most states restore rights after ex-offenders complete their prison sentence, their parole, and their probation. So we can see that Florida has like a much stricter rule, and just the 8% of appeal approval is very low.
Yeah, and it's like a 12,000 people backlog of people are applying. So that's even another problem facing them.
So what happens with most people, most ex-offenders, is after they get out of prison, they feel this pressure on them because society basically just treats them like second-class citizens. So they end up going back to prison, and that cycle is called recidivism. And in Florida, the recidivism rate is 33% 3 years after prison, and this increases to more than 60% after 5 years after prison. So, and that's really shocking. And in one of the petitions that I signed, one of the facts said that studies from the Florida Parole Commission show that people who get their rights restored are less likely to commit crimes in the future. And I think that's a very important thing to note when reading our policy paper. And this is why we want society to be able to alleviate these negative effects of disenfranchisement on formerly incarcerated individuals. So basically, going into our policy paper right now, some of the tangible goals that we have to alleviate the negative effects of disenfranchisement is for society to educate the public on disenfranchisement through university programs.
Also through banning the box that asks them about their conviction history.
And we also want to expedite the process because we see, especially in Florida as a swing state, the government determines what the process will be for appealing, and it shouldn't be by each 4 years it changes.
So yeah, if you'd like to know more about that, be sure to read our policy paper. I hope you enjoyed our little introduction Trialogue podcast. Again, we are the Tamir Rice Group.
Stay safe.
Stay vigilant.
And stay woke.